Imagine this. You're on set with a full camera package. All your lights are dialed in. The scene's blocked, but something feels off. The shot is clean, it's technically correct, but it's not telling you anything. Here's the truth. Without intention, your lighting and composition are just decoration. In this video, I'm breaking down how I use framing and lighting choices to push the story forward in a recent Spec commercial, and how getting intentional with these two things can completely change the way your work is received. In this video, I'm breaking down how I use framing and lighting choices to push the story forward in a recent Spec commercial, and how getting intentional with these two things can completely change the way your work is received. We'll walk through how I shape light to create emotional contrast, how I use framing to isolate or connect characters, and how every choice was designed to support the story, not distract from it. Because when you combine story-driven lighting with purposeful composition, that's when your cinematography starts to feel intentional, not just pretty. Before we dive into some examples, let's talk about something that often gets skipped: context. As a cinematographer, your job isn't just to make things look good, it's to make things feel right for the story. And that only happens when you're aligned with your director. You need to understand what the scene is really about. What emotion are we trying to evoke here? What perspective are we seeing this from? What's the energy we want the audience to feel? These are questions that you have to ask yourself, because every lighting choice, every camera angle, and every frame, it all needs to be intentional. You can't just throw a backlight on and hope it looks cool. You need to know why it's there and what it's saying. When you take the time to align with your director, to dig into the tone, the pacing, the subtext, you give yourself clarity to make decisions that actually push the story forward. And that's what separates a good-looking shot from a great one. So let's dive into this and see how you can apply it to your work. I know a lot in these cine breakdowns, you guys are looking for the exact settings and everything that we use to achieve these shots. Yeah, we're going to be going over that, but I also want to cover why I chose to do things, why I chose to light things, why I chose to get, like in this case, this high camera angle. So let's really start with that. So in the scene, what is happening is that the mom is frantically looking for something specific in a messy household. So I had to line with the director and say, like, ask, hey, what are we feeling? She's feeling frantic, and I want to showcase what's going on in the scene. Obviously, this comes with a great director and aligning with that even beforehand and coming up with a storyboard and shot list. So everything was already pretty clear to me, but it automatically gave me ideas and decisions to make when it came to actually framing this up. So when we talk about this and getting a high angle, I love to do this in my work, and not necessarily a top down, almost like 30 to 45 degrees. That's what I was looking to do here and get as high as possible while giving that perspective. So this entire commercial was shot on the Sony Venice, and then some specialty shots you'll see with the FX3. So in this case, we're using the Venice, and then I'm rated this at the first base ISO of 500 EI. And then here I am using the 21mm R-less lens. So we had access to the B set and A set. I really preferred the B set, which had the 14mm at a 14, a 21, 40, and like on the opposite extra spectrum, like a 135, and there was also a lens in between that. But I really love to use the 21 and 40 because that is the visual language that I really like to do. And when it comes to like shots like this, when you're looking for something grand and you want to go something wide, like a 20, 21, 25, and then even something down wide to a 14, but we wanted some compression to really isolate what's going on here and not give away too much of the room because we already established what's going on. She's frantic, it's messy, and then we wanted to showcase that it's a mess with all these toys and stuff, and this gave us a lot of opportunities to tell the story through the frame. So automatically, again, I went on this high angle with the camera pointing down. And what happens when you're trying to achieve these shots specifically with a tripod or anything like that, obviously due to the nature of the tripod, the legs are going to be seen. So what we did is we had a set of Mitchell sticks, which has an O'Connor head, which are usually generally used for bigger camera packages. But this allows a lot of flexibility when you're trying to put the camera in different places, just because everything is so big, stout, and robust. So I have a bunch of Mitchell risers that I use to offset from the tripod head and the tripod legs. So those are the Mitchell risers that I used here. And then I used a Mitchell offset plate that connected us to the tripod itself down here. And then we sandbag the hell out of it, just to make sure that this wouldn't tip forward, obviously with all that weight. It wasn't a big, I believe it's only like a 2 foot or 1 foot Mitchell offset, but that was enough so we didn't see any of the legs and we could really tell the story here. You could rotate the legs so you have the longer leg in the backwards of position, but this really helped us get over everything and then give us more of a top-down feel rather than just a 45, because we didn't necessarily want to compromise. And then you're going to be like, oh, why didn't you just rig something up on a goalpost to shoot directly down? That wasn't what the director was looking for. This was very narrative, and that feels a little bit way too commercial. And those are things you're just going to have to figure out in terms of visual style. So if we kind of look at a top-down of the situation and what's going on here, we have our couch, and then we have our talent, and then we have our camera pointing down at this angle down here. And then throughout this entire location, it was a beautiful location that had access to a pool with a bunch of windows that surrounded basically the inside. And it was the perfect to light and make a modular lighting setup. So the lighting setup that I'm going to be talking about is that we had two 600Cs. So one with a spotlight, and then we had another 600C. And that was with a Fresnel. Then in addition to that, we had a 60B. With a spotlight as well. And then a F22C with just the stock diffusion, so really nothing to write on that, but I had a 4x4 silk that I used a lot of the times. It's for face shots that really had to feel a little bit more commercial and not necessarily with harsh sources and everything like that. And then we had a 4 kit of MCs that I just used for pockets of light in random places, as well as key lights, especially when we were doing a lot of probe shots in this piece. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, obviously sets and types of lights. That is relatively small for the look that we achieved in this commercial, and that's something that I'm super proud about, because we had the ideal location that the director really wanted. And then she also has a cinematography background. She's like, perfect, there's lots of natural sunlight in here. This gives you a great opportunity just to use whatever fixtures that you want. And a lot of people associate these big looks with using big lights and everything like that, but we just use all LED fixtures, and it was the perfect timing of day and finding the perfect location. And then when I even look at the location and just talk about this in general, so you guys have a little bit of context, we are currently shooting in this room here, which is the living room, and we shot everywhere, but all this inside corner here is all windows. And then the sun came up in the east here and then set in the west. So our sun was constantly moving throughout and gave me a lot of natural light coming through these windows. So automatically, I'm like, I'm really good for the day. This is going to give me my ambience, and I just have to add a lot of hot spots to replicate that sun, because obviously at the height of the day, that sun is going to be more shooting downwards rather than going across my scene. So I'm just going to add my fixtures to bring that light across, because my ambience is always there. And then another big thing with the director is I had to step in and say like, hey, what is this supposed to feel like? What time of day is this? Which is very important, because this was montage and we wanted this to happen over multiple days. If I lit everything daylight for all these montage scenes, it wouldn't feel correct. It would feel very weird. So that just gives you some context of what we're talking about, and we had that kit there. So what I had is I had the Fresnel 600C over here, and then I had the spotlight basically right beside it. And this is again two 600Cs. And what I use the Fresnel to is to stretch across my frame to add more light into the scene. Because if we look at these hot spots here, that is coming from the sunlight, and I had to bring that right across all the way to the edge of frame. And you can see how long these shadows are, which is really associated with evening or morning time. So this was like one of those like morning scenes where she just, dropped off her kid for school and she's cleaning up the entire mess. So we're looking around 10 o'clock, and that usually wouldn't happen around 10. It would probably happen around like 7 a.m. or even 8 a.m. depending on where you are exactly in the world as well. And then we have the spotlight here, and that is adding hot spots on the couch and just other areas that we can add that to. So I use this very intentionally just to hit those, and then I use the Fresnel to spread it across the scene. So these are things that you just really have to consider, and just when you go and average the scene, once you have your lighting team and everybody set up, just ask, hey, how does this feel? What are we supposed to be feeling here? And then we go into the next shot of the sequence where she actually pulls something out of under the couch. And then we simply did this with a low set of 6, and we're just sitting right there beside her. But this really gives you what we're looking at, and you can see that 600C acting as the sun. It's really easy to look at that and see like, oh, that's the sun, and they timed this perfectly, and like you don't necessarily need any more lights here. And in that case, we didn't. That was a stand, and it's hiding behind a hedge as well as some bushes there, but you can see a little bit, if you look hard enough, the edge of the stand right there. But it really worked for what we were going for. And then in addition, we have a lot of white walls in this house, so it was really easy not to add a bunch of other fixtures because there was so much ambience from all this light bouncing back into her. It's usually associated once you have like a harsh edge light here. You really want to wrap that across depending on what look you're necessarily going for. And I wanted these scenes to feel, again, cohesive, but I didn't need to necessarily make it that commercial of something like a McDonald's commercial. We were kind of watching the action, and then we got into it a little bit. And then if I was doing something a little bit more commercial, I would add an F22C here or a bounce board to wrap this light around even more. And at this point, I had all my lights up from what we were looking at in the previous scene, and that 600C is doing all the work here. And then I asked the director, I'm like, hey, do you want to wrap this a little bit more? And obviously I can talk to her in terms of like a cinematography standpoint, but she's like, no, I like the contrast ratio. I like what we're doing here. I don't want this like too commercial. And we really liked what was going on with the edge lighting that was here that just automatically pops her out. And also the harsh highlights that we see that pop her sweater out more, that just really sell what sunlight is supposed to even look like. And then you have that brief over here. And then when we even look at the light that is coming in here, and we ask ourselves, if we really thought about it, if the sun is there blasting through this window, why isn't it doing the same here? And that's something I simply missed because, again, this was a narrative commercial and we were trying to get this whole montage sequence, and it was a day of almost 30 shots, which is very ambitious for what we're doing. So I even studied my work, and I'm saying like, I could have added another fixture or even just spun the other spotlight around and asked for like maybe 2 more minutes to light this, and I could have had some harsh highlights coming down in here. So that is just something I'm like, I look back and I'm like, yeah, I could have done, but it was such a quick shot that you don't really notice it at all. Now, next shot here, we have our main talent looking into the refrigerator. And for this, we use the FX3 with a Laowa 12mm, which is one of my favorite lenses to use in this case scenario. And then we're sitting at an aperture of T2.9, which is the lowest aperture, which really aligns with the commercial look that we're going for. So what's going on here is that we obviously have established a, kind of almost split lighting interface. We have our light side here, and then we also have some shadow on this side. And I use this trick of bouncing light into my subject to really get that going across. So if we draw out our top down of this scenario, I had all day these two 600Cs outside, one with, again, a spotlight, and then the other with the Fresnel. And in this case, I didn't really need to do much because you can see all the light coming in from the natural daylight, and it's pretty relatively low in the sky. And this was one of the not first shots we did, but before lunch. So there was a lot to play with, and I didn't necessarily have to light in terms of spreading that light across. And then it wasn't really associated with golden hour because I asked the director of like, hey, what part of the day is in this? And she's like, oh, she's about to look in the fridge, realize there's nothing there, go grab her keys, and then go do some groceries. So I'm like, okay, almost early morning right after cleanup. And she's like, yes, that's exactly what we're going for. So I'm like, perfect. I don't need to add any streaks of light in the background. I don't need to get confused. I know exactly what time of day this is, so it fits for the commercial. The only thing that we did is I used the Fresnel. Sorry, I didn't draw the rest of this diagram over here. Our talent is looking into our fridge here, and the doors are open. And then I aimed this light with the Fresnel as a backlight and an edge light, and you can see that harsh highlight right there. And then I also aimed that at the door here, and then what it's doing is bouncing back and hitting her in the face. And then I biased it on that side rather hitting the other side of the door, so I could have at least some of that split lighting, especially when she's looking around in the shot specifically, right? And then in addition to that, we also put an MC here on camera side, so right here, just to add in a catch light when she looks at the fridge specifically and she's looking around as well. If you're looking to add catch lights into your work, literally MCs, small lights, anything that you can really find, just you need it in front of the camera right next to it if you want a quick and easy catch light. The bigger the source, the bigger your catch light is going to be, and that's really associated with what you're trying to create. If you want something that's a little bit more dramatic and a little bit more punchier, I would just have the catch light next to the camera, and it would be a small catch light like an MC. But if you want something more softer, something more a little bit more emotional that tells a lot of tone that you can just tell in the eye as well, use something bigger. Use something that you can actually see, and it's just not necessarily a point. So a quick and easy shot, but something that was really fun in terms of just utilizing what bounce light does. The next sequence that we're going to be looking at is one of my favorite techniques I like to do when it comes to cinematography and camera settings and not necessarily talking about lighting, and that is the classic slow shutter. And this is actually known as step printing if you guys are interested in how to do it on a mirrorless camera such as a Sony FX3 or something like a DSLR or anything like that. Just you crank your shutter speed, but if you're looking to do this on a cinema camera, it's a little bit more involved. So we again are on the Sony Venice, and then if we look at the focal length that we're looking at here, this is a little bit more watching, and then we get a little bit more intimate here. So we use the same focal length, which was the, sorry, let's just type out everything here, Venice. And this is one of my favorite lenses, which is the 40mm. Almost like a 35, but I don't really like the 35. I like a little bit tighter. Again, this just comes in with what you like as a cinematographer. And then, yeah, obviously we shot this at the normal frame rate here, but to get the slow shutter effect that you see here, we shot at a frame rate of 3 FPS on the Sony Venice. Oops. And then a 360-degree shutter. So this really depends on what camera you're using. I always like to do this on a Sony FX3 because it's a lot easier and you can visualize it and then you can really play with it in post. With a cinema camera like an RE or anything like that, you don't really have an option to overcrank your shutter. Like I know on the Sony FX9 specifically, you can go past 360 degrees and it makes it really easy. But usually on a lot of cameras, it tops off at 360 degrees. Then you have to lower your frame rate. So then the frames start blurring together even more. But the problem, what happens is when you bring this into post, it's like very sped up and very like what is going on. And what you have to do is reconvert it to a 24 frame per second timeline. And it gives you those frames that really blur together and everything like that. And then you're going to ask the question of how did I know this? I watched a lot of tutorials and I did a lot of experimentation just to figure it out. And I love to do this. And something that I added even in here, even more, is to add some moving light. So again, I'm going to be repeating myself a lot in this case, but we are dealing with the same setup. And this was obviously shot at night because we're planning to do this stuff, but she just came with her groceries and it's a late night. And then we have our 600C with a spotlight, as well as a 600C with a Fresnel. And then what I did is I had my gaffer and grip just rotate these constantly, and I set them to a color temperature of 3200 Kelvin. And that was mainly just giving that warmth of like maybe potential car lights going past. It doesn't make sense because we're at the tail end of the montage, and then the director and I were like, yeah, let's play around with this. Let's get a little bit more creative with it. How can we tell the story even more? So in the sequence, what happens is the lights pass through once, and then we go to the slow shutter sequence to get that going. And what that does really is it helps even sell the effect even more because you get highlights that are kind of dragged throughout the entire shot, and that really sell the effect a lot more as well. And then you don't necessarily need a lot here because you come back to this shot and then we have a harsh edge light as well as some Rembrandt lighting here that looks like sunlight, but then when you look outside, it's completely dark. And then you even see the highlight here. So if you were to look at this shot specifically, you're like, wow, this looks really good. But then if you really look at a technical mindset of like, this makes no sense because it's dark outside and you have these bright lights coming through. But I'm like, why does it look like sunlight? So that just goes off with what we were trying to do in this piece. This was frantic. This was a scene in the montage where everything starts to get really tired. And that's what is the whole point of this entire commercial. And then when we talk about composition and just adding more depth into your foreground, as just salt and pepper, we like to call it, which is light and dark parts, is that we cheated in a little bit of this wall that we're shooting in the corner here, as well as that. And it just frames up everything nicely to give you that watching aesthetic that is really associated with narrative commercials when you want to watch something. But then when we are trying to feel exactly what's going on, which is like chaos and everything that is happening, we get in there a little bit more personal. And I'm doing this on a handheld rig with the easy rig. And I just changed my settings and went in for some shots. And this is just us walking around, going back to the fridge, opening and closing the fridge, walking around the table, and then just really freestyling it. And the editor had a lot to play with, but the director loved it at this point because it was like, yes, this is exactly what I'm looking for specifically. And then here is another example of step printing as well that we did. And this one was an experimentation because I really wanted to add even more movement into this. So again, we're using the same settings, 3 FPS at a 360-degree shutter instead of 180. And in this case, we are looking at this couch area, as well as we have that big corner of the room and everything like that. And the camera is on a dolly. And I wanted to introduce a little bit of movement into this, but then this gets really confusing, especially on cinema cameras, because of the sped up frame rate in that. I basically want a time lapse and a photo time lapse that you get with a lot of motion blur and everything. But to do that with video required a lot of experimentation on my part specifically. So if we go and do some math here, so if I'm trying to create 3 FPS to a 24 timeline, so if we do 24 divided by 3, this is going to be sped up 8 times, right? So that's exactly what I'm looking for. So if I'm looking for a 5-second shot or even a 3-second shot in this case, I believe, let's just go on the basis of that we wanted something that was 5 seconds. I'm going to multiply that 5 seconds by 8, and this is going to give me 40 seconds that this dolly has to be, and the dolly has to be smooth as possible. So just to reframe here what we exactly did, this dolly to give us a 5-second shot, so 5-second final, had to be 40 seconds long in terms of me just pushing actually on the day. And then another complication with that is that you want your talent to be moving so much and so fast in that. So what we did is we experimented of just doing this dolly for the 40 seconds, had her sit down here, go over here, adjust her, put her jacket down here, adjust this throw, adjust these pillows, and then move back over here, open the fridge, adjust something in the kitchen and everything like that. And yes, you could do all those actions once in 40 seconds. But then when we did playback just to see what the initial shot would look like, we're like, oh, this is not going to work. And then that's when I said, I'm like, hey, we just need to speed everything up. So can you just tell her to sprint? And that's what I told the director. So literally, if you see in the BTS, she's frantically running from spot 1 to 2 to 3. And then the director just told her, like, do this, do that, do that. And then I told her, I'm like, be more exaggerated with your moves and everything like that. So it sells the effect even more. And what is really hard on my point to do exactly as well is that we had a timer going to show how exactly the speed I had to go with that. But I had to be exactly the same speed throughout, because if you have jumps in speed and everything like that, you can really tell, and it doesn't really sell the effect well because you're moving like faster than slower and everything. So you need to have a steady hand and push the dolly, and that just comes with like experience and just practicing so much, because we did that a lot too. Then in addition to that, we had the 2 lights again outside on play. Not going to draw them out because you know they're 2 600s. And then I had my gaffer and grip just slowly rotate them through the scene. Not quick and fast to look like a strobe party or anything, but just slowly paint the scene with light. And then in addition to that, we did this static, and we did this in so many just different variations. So we had so much to play with in post. And then what I did in addition to give me more of this blue tone and everything like that, as the sun was setting, and then we didn't have any more sunlight, but there was still some ambient, I set my camera's white balance to 4400 Kelvin, which pushed all the natural light to this more bluer tone. And then I set my fixtures out here to 3200 Kelvin, because just the color contrast between the orange and blue, which is that natural orange and teal look that I go for in a lot of things, and the director really wanted, that just naturally just plays up in that. But when you, in an instance that you don't have like enough lights to even light that with blue light, just switch your camera's white balance, push that more, and then even push your lights a little bit warmer so it balances out and doesn't look too dramatic. So the last scene that we're going to go into really hits home of what I'm trying to teach you guys when it comes to aligning with a director and choosing the right focal lengths, lighting, everything that has to do with cinematography to get the proper point across. If we remind ourselves what the commercial is about at this point, the director really wanted to hammer home the traumatic experience that she had in her childhood. So anytime that she looks at water and is any near water, she is reminded of that experience. And we wanted a moment in the montage for that to happen. And a perfect moment to happen at that night is that if she has a pool and if it's at night, and this really gives us an opportunity to give us some flexibility in the montage specifically. So before we talk about lens choices, let's see how we achieve this, because we have some light in the pool that is coming off and basically lighting the entire scene. If you look out here, we have a bunch of light from the outdoor patio lights and everything like that, and that's something that we can turn off, but they're perfectly exposed that it really worked for us regardless, so I wasn't too concerned about that. So if we draw, again, our talent is here, camera is over here in the corner, and then I have a 600C with the Fresnel, and this is just on a normal stand, and this was sitting at 5%. We didn't need a lot of light here. And then we have our big body of water, which is our pool, and it's skipping across from that, and it's really highlighting what's going on, everything here. So the light is bouncing off that pool and then coming up into her, and then you could see that angle of light right here, and then it's giving you that ripply effect that is really associated with water. So when we were actually shooting this, I asked my gaffer to like, hey, can you just like make some ripples in the water and then let it settle? And that's when we actually started taking some takes of this and what's going on. So this perfectly gives her an edge light in the front that is associated with what lighting choices that we have to make. Again, this is a very traumatic experience, and we have to be observing what's happening. So automatically, when I think of observing, I'm going to go for something like a 50 plus when it comes to my focal lengths, because I'm not necessarily in the moment there. So in this case, we use a 75mm, and I'm all the way backed up in the corner, and I'm watching this happen. And then this is a feeling of isolation, of trauma. So I use the framing here to isolate her right in the middle. And then again, this is very emotional, and we don't necessarily want to see a lot of details. She's almost like a silhouette at this point, and that's why we have this edge lighting that is really associated with something that is very emotional and dramatic. So these are the kind of choices that you have to really take into advantage when you're thinking and aligning with a director of what they want specifically. The director already communicated everything so well in terms of the scene specifically. She's like, I want it at night, I want this really dark and moody, and that's really about it. You play with whatever you want. But if you think about it, if a director didn't know that specifically, and you wanted this scene in the middle of the montage, you're like, oh, if I didn't align with what the story is supposed to feel like, I'd just shoot this in the middle of the day because it would be easier. But then that doesn't give you the emotional tone that you're looking for. It would be more like not even comedic, but it wouldn't give you the drama that we're looking for. So these things are very important, especially in the pre-production process when you're aligning with a director, making your shot list, even building out your kit of what you're looking for. If this was supposed to be, again, a lighthearted commercial, and I wouldn't shoot anything on, basically, I would stick on an 18, a 25, and a 35, and I wouldn't go basically further than that. But because this is a narrative commercial, I'm going to have a lot more telephoto lenses in my kit. So these are just things to think about, especially when you're trying to develop your career as a cinematographer.